he feels this deep pain in his kneecaps, but it's not just the pressure of fingers. He literally feels like claws or fingernails or something like tearing into his flesh, and he can actually feel the nails sinking into him. So, once again, you found yourself at the campsite of the Orator. But please pull up a chair. As you can see, my fire is stoked, which means I have another tale to tell. In fact, I have 2 tales to tell tonight. But before we begin, if you do find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, then like this video, but then also subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. Not only will you be notified every single time I upload new content, but it also helps me to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. Next, all of my stories are first-hand accounts of the supernatural and paranormal. So, if you or anybody you know has a story like that, supernatural, paranormal, demons, ghosts, spirits, cryptids, anything like that, and you would like to be featured on this channel, then please either comment below or reach out to me on any one of my socials, and you and I will find a time to sit down, collect your story, and it will be retold here on the Orator channel. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to today's double feature. Our first story is called His Right Arm. So it is the summer of 2009, and you have Brian and Chance, and they're basically best friends, and they're in high school. They're about 16, 17 years old. They've been best friends forever. And they're into all sorts of different stuff, but one day, as dumb boys sometimes do, they decide to try out an OUIJA board. The problem is, they did not have an OUIJA board, so instead, they made one. They got a piece of paper, they looked up a picture online, and they basically replicated it exactly. And because they didn't have an OUIJA board, they also didn't have what's called the planchette, which is kind of like the little heart-shaped mover device where you kind of choose where the different letters are and what gets spelled out and stuff like that. So instead, they used a toonie, which is a $2 coin in Canada, and that was their replacement planchette. And so they are at Brian's house down in his basement. They turn off the lights down there so it's completely black. And then they light a couple candles kind of throughout the room so they have just enough light, and they have that creepy ambiance and all that kind of stuff. And so they're sitting there on the floor. They got their, drawn Ouija board. They have their little tuning planchette, and they are ready to go. And so, like is common and usually the case, they start asking questions to the other side to see if they can get an answer. And the first question that they ask, which is very typical, is there a presence or an entity here, something like that? And lo and behold, of course, the little toonie slides to yes. And so they're like, all right, cool, there is something here. And then they ask, what's your name? How old are you? And they sort of ask those 2 questions back to back, which typically you only want to ask 1 question at a time so you get concrete answers. But they ask 2 questions back to back. And so this thing goes to the letter Z. That's where the toonie slides first. And then it slides to the number 7. So they're kind of confused. Like, is its name Z? Was it confused? Was there something lost in translation? And also, 7? Is it the spirit of a 7-year-old? Is it something that's 700 years old? Something just didn't feel right. It was a little bit weird. And so they continue to ask more questions. They say, okay, so what are you? And this toonie slowly slides to D-E-M-O-N. This thing is a demon. And so at this point, Brian is kind of thinking that Chance is screwing with him, and he's the one that's kind of moving the toonie around. And so he asks, what is it that you're doing here? What is it you want? And the thing doesn't move at all. And so getting kind of frustrated and fed up and sort of like the game is over, Brian just says, okay, you know what? If there's really a demonic presence here, prove it. And they sit there for a second, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, at once, all of their candles go out at the same time. Simultaneously, as if that wasn't terrifying enough, Brian's entire right arm goes completely numb. And it's not anywhere else on his body. It's not goosebumps. He literally feels it from the shoulder all the way to the fingertips, completely numb, and it's kind of vibrating and almost painful. But he's a lot more worried about the fact that all the lights are off and they're down in this basement, and clearly something is communicating with him. So he jumps up, he runs over, and as soon as he flips on the light to the basement, feeling starts to return to his arm. And then throughout the night, they put everything away and they burn the piece of paper and they get rid of all that stuff. And they're just sort of sitting there and they don't really want to talk about what happened because they were just doing this for a little bit of fun. But clearly something more sinister has taken place. And so they're sitting there, they don't want to talk about it. And the feelings starting to come back in Brian's arm. But as he's sort of testing it, he's noticing he can feel pressure, but not any pain at all. And so he starts kind of ramping it up and trying to hit his hand on different stuff. And yeah, he can feel the impact and he can sort of feel stuff in his hand and in his arm, but it still doesn't feel any pain. And so really, really weirded out by this. But other than that, everything else seemed kind of normal. So that night, they stay up. They talk about a lot of things, but none of it had to do with the Ouija board. Next morning, Chance leaves. And now Brian is at home. And that's when the real stuff starts. So at first, it's just small stuff. And it's almost always when he's down in the basement. He'll be down there doing something, and he'll hear footsteps walking up and down the stairs when no one else is home. Or somebody will be home, but he goes and looks, and there's clearly nobody there. So that kind of stuff happens. He'll feel taps on his shoulder. He'll maybe hear voices and stuff like that. And yes, definitely weird, and it had never happened before they had gotten the Ouija board. But after a while of this happening and nothing else happening, he kind of got used to it. Like, yes, it's weird. Clearly there's something here, but it doesn't seem to be malicious, and so it is what it is. Well, after a while, he stops reacting to this stuff, and he just sort of ignores it. Apparently that was the wrong thing to do because the spirit starts ramping stuff up. Instead of just tapping him on the shoulder, this spirit would start pushing him. And he'd kind of get lurched forward, or it would tug on his hair, or he'd feel a slap across his face, something really kind of aggressive, and then he'd hear laughter. This kind of like wild, dark, deep laughter, and then he'd literally hear footsteps running up the stairs. And so over time, because he was ignoring this demon or spirit, whatever this dark presence was, it went from kind of, just messing with him to sort of ramping it up. And then over time, he started to feel this thing follow him to his bedroom. So it used to be contained in the basement, but over time, and we're talking like a 2-year stint of it going from not aggressive to becoming more and more aggressive, he started to experience this stuff kind of ramp up. And so he'd go to his room and he'd literally feel this dark presence follow him into his room. And then as he's going to sleep, he literally felt like he was being watched. And it just got more and more, kind of aggressive and upsetting and dark. And he didn't really know what to do. And then one night, he's asleep in his room. And he wakes up. And for the first time in his life, he experienced what most people would call sleep paralysis, which is basically where you wake up and you're conscious, but you can't move. You're literally like glued to your bed. And he can't move. He's opening his eyes and he's looking around and he's trying not to panic, but this is the first time it's ever happened to him where he woke up and he can't do anything. He's conscious, but he can't move. And he's looking around, wondering what's going on, and that feeling of being watched is there. And he remembers looking, and he kind of had a mirror that was hanging on his closet door, and then he also had a standing mirror in his room, and he could kind of look over and see the two reflecting back and forth, at each other. And so they're sort of facing each other. And as his eyes start to adjust to the darkness, for the first time ever, he sees this entity. And it's just basically a black human-like outline. He can't really make out any details at all, but it's just standing there at the foot of his bed sort of staring at him. And it was almost like it was waiting for him to wake up, because once he sort of wakes up and adjusts and realizes what's going on, the thing goes from just standing there observing him to it walks over to the foot of his bed, sits down, and then it reaches out its fingers and grabs his kneecaps and starts squeezing. And, Brian, he feels this deep pain in his kneecaps, but it's not just the pressure of fingers. He literally feels like claws or fingernails or something like tearing into his flesh, and he can actually feel the nails sinking into him. And he's, wants to scream out in pain. He wants to move. He wants to do something, but he literally can't move, can't speak, can't make a noise. And he said it felt like hours of this thing just grabbing his knees and squeezing them, and he could feel the pain getting worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, the entity stands back up, and it walks over to his mirror that was on the door, and it just sort of phases into the mirror and enters it. And as it does, it's a pretty tall being, it kind of gets smaller to enter the mirror. And then it turns around and it's looking at him, and then all of a sudden it starts laughing. And this laugh is deep, maniacal, crazier than any laughter he's ever heard. And he said it's starting to get so loud that the room is starting to shake with it. And then all of a sudden this thing stops laughing, steps out of its mirror and into the other standing mirror. And then sort of almost like ripples on the water, it just sort of ripples away. And as soon as it disappears, he can move again. His sleep paralysis is broken, and he literally busts up out of bed. He runs over, he grabs this standing mirror, he runs it out of their house to their garbage can, and he literally just breaks it. And the glass shatters, and it literally just rains down into the garbage can. And all at once, it's like every pain that his right arm should have experienced over those 2 years, it all came at once. It was just like every cut, every bruise, every hit. They didn't impact his skin. You couldn't see it, but it was the pain from all of those injuries hit his arm all at one time. And he literally just drops to his knees, and he's holding his arm, and it's the worst pain he can possibly imagine. But then over time, it starts to subside. He's breathing a little better. He gets up, he goes inside, he sits down on his bed, and for the first time in 2 years, that evil presence has dissipated. He doesn't feel it anymore. And he looks down, and his knees are all sliced up, and they're not just little cuts, they're really nasty cuts. And after that, luckily, he hid the knees, he wrapped them up, and he made sure nobody knew what was going on. But then after that, he must have trapped the spirit in the mirror and then broke it, because that spirit vanished from the house. He never had any other demonic presences that happened in that house. But to this day, he still has those deep scars all over his knees. All right, now before we move on to today's second tale, I do want to reiterate that all of the stories I tell on my channel are firsthand true accounts of the supernatural and paranormal. So if you or anybody you know has a story like that, a supernatural or paranormal story that is firsthand, then please reach out to me in the comments or on any one of my socials, which I'll have posted here and in the description below. We will find a time to get together and you could tell me your tale, and then one day, hopefully, we can feature it here on the Orator channel. Now, let's get on to today's second tale. This is entitled Dogman. So, it's February of 2007, and Jeff and Ben are good friends, and they live in rural Indiana, and they actually work together, and they work overnight in a warehouse. And they're at work one night, and it's really slow, and so their boss says, hey, you know what? We're slow enough to where the two of you guys can just go home tonight. And so they get in their respective vehicles, and they start to head home. Now, it's rural Indiana, lots of back roads and dirt roads and stuff like that, and they live in roughly the same direction. And so Ben is in front, Jeff is behind him, and Jeff's just sort of following at a distance as they drive down the road. And Jeff kind of notices that Ben sort of swerves out of the way, and he's sort of like, they're half asleep because it's the middle of the night and they work the night shift, and so it kind of wakes him up, and he's like, oh, maybe he, almost fell asleep and he woke up, or maybe something walked out in front of the car or something like that, I don't know. But he's kind of paying attention now, when all of a sudden, he realizes that what Ben had swerved out of the way of was something gigantic standing in the middle of the road, sort of walking down the road. And as he gets closer to this thing, instead of just swerving around it because he kind of got alerted because of Ben, he slows down almost to a stop, and he's looking at this thing. And what he's looking at is something that he can't really understand. It's about 7 feet tall, and it's corporeal. It's clearly a being, something that he can see. Now, he can actually see the outline of this thing, and it seemingly doesn't have any head at all. It has a torso, but no arms, and then it clearly has 2 really thick legs. And as he's looking, he can see that the lights, the brake lights from Ben's truck are, bright, and these legs are blocking the light from it. So he's like, it's not see-through. This isn't like a spirit or something like that. This is a physical entity. But outside of that, he didn't really know what it was that he was looking at. And he's kind of watching as this thing sort of shambles towards his truck. And it's kind of like these weird jerking movements. And, he said, it as silly as this sounds, he kind of described it as one of these, those flailing tube men kind of things. It sort of moved like that, where it would bend over and then sort of lurch up. And he could hear it, its feet stomping across the ground and the rocks in the road. And it's walking towards the driver's side of his car. And as he's looking, he's saying, it's not a bear. It doesn't have fur of any kind. It's got kind of like sleek, oily-looking skin, but it's like this dark, brownish, black, bruised-looking skin. And clearly it doesn't have arms. Clearly it doesn't have a head. And as it's getting closer to him, he's noticing that it's leaned over, and it's over 7 feet tall. Now, he's driving an Explorer that's about 6.5 feet tall, and this thing is above what he can see out his window. And so he's just staring, watching this thing, and it's standing next to his car, and then it just sort of starts shambling away. And at this point, he's really freaked out. He has no idea what the heck this thing is, and so he hits the gas. Ben in front of him hits the gas, and they just fly down the road. And they go a little distance when all of a sudden Ben pulls over kind of on this little side thing that he can pull into, where it's not the ditch or anything like that. It's just sort of like a turnaround point. He pulls in, and Jeff follows him. They both park, they get out, and they're kind of talking about, did you see that? What did you see? And basically, they realize they both saw the same thing. No head, no arms, thick legs, thick torso, skin, no fur, no clue what it is. And they're like, we just saw something we were not supposed to see. And Jeff, he's kind of a brave guy. He says, that was weird. We got an okay look at it. There's 2 of us. Let's just go back and look at this thing. And it takes a second to convince Ben, but he's like, yeah, you're right. There's 2 of us. Let's just go look at this thing. We'll stay in our vehicles. We don't have to get out, but let's really see what the heck this thing is. And so they turn around. This time, Jeff is in front. Ben is behind. And they drive all the way back down the road to where this thing was. And they're getting kind of close. And so Jeff, he slows down. And he's just kind of driving, kind of keeping his eye out, watching where his lights are. When all of a sudden, in the middle of the road, laying down, is a dog. And it's right at the spot where they saw this other creature. And so Jeff, he stops his car and he's looking at it. And he's like, okay, this is a big dog, but it's not anywhere near as that big as that other thing. That other thing was like 7 feet tall. This dog is maybe like, it's under 6 feet long. If it were to stand up, it wouldn't be anywhere near as tall. Plus, it's a dog. It's got fur. I can see its pointy ears. I mean, this thing is just a dog. It's clearly not what we saw before. And so Jeff, in his mind, he's trying to rationalize this. He's thinking, I don't know, maybe it was what I saw before and I was just freaking out. I don't really know, but maybe this thing got hit and it was kind of wriggling and I just hallucinated. I don't know. Like, he's trying to process what this could possibly be and sort of put the 2 things together, but it's just not making sense. And so he gets out of his truck and he kind of tentatively takes a couple steps towards this dog, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like this dog is dead. It's lying on the road. It's not moving at all. And so he's thinking, man, this sucks, And it's a big German Shepherd-looking dog, but it's got really thick black fur. And so it doesn't really look like any type of dog he's seen before. But, he doesn't like to see a dead dog. That's a shame. And so he goes to take another step towards it when all of a sudden, this thing lifts up its head and looks at him, and it starts doing this really deep, guttural growl. And Jeffy stops, and he kind of takes a step back. And he's thinking, this dog was for sure dead a minute ago. What the heck? And then as he's watching this dog, it kind of picks itself up and it's trying to stand, but it seems like it's injured. It's kind of hobbling around when all of a sudden it pushes itself up and it stands up on its hind legs. And Jeff is kind of taking this all in and he's looking at this thing. And part of his mind is like, this is a thing straight out of fiction. It looks like a werewolf or something like that. But as he's looking at it, he's noticing it just looks like a dog. It's got dog paws. It doesn't have like clawed hands or anything crazy like that. It's got pointed ears on the top of its head. But there it is standing as if it were a human. And it's just sort of looking at him. And then all of a sudden, it kind of falls to all fours. But then it runs on 2 feet off the road and into the forest. And Jeff just kind of watches this thing go. And he knows the area pretty well. And he knows that, off a couple yards from the road, there are these tall fences, these tall chain link fences because it's private property. And so he's waiting to hear this thing run into that fence or something like that. And he just sees it run off into the woods and he just doesn't hear anything at all after that. And so he's standing there, he's waiting. And then all of a sudden, Ben comes walking up and he's like, what the heck was that? And they're kind of having a conversation about it when all of a sudden they look down. And where the dog had been, there's now this field mouse. And it was completely wet. And Jeff is like, okay, well, it wasn't raining or snowing or anything like that, so I don't know how it got wet that way. And also, what the heck is it doing here? And it's sitting there, and it's on its hind legs, but it's kind of cleaning itself. And so they're sort of watching this, and they're talking between themselves, and they think, maybe the dog was trying to eat it, and that's why it's wet. It was in its mouth, and then we came upon it. And they're trying to figure out what the heck could have happened tonight. But it's, late, turning into early morning. And at some point, they just say, this is really weird. We don't know. And so they get into their car. They head home. And then the next day, they go back to work. And Jeff, he's trying to kind of tell people what happened. But Ben wants literally no part of it. He's like, he even pulled Jeff aside. And he's like, listen, I'm going to deny all this stuff. This was really weird. Stop talking about it, okay? It was really weird, really freaky, but no one's going to believe us. And it was true. Jeff tried to tell people, but they were just laughing at him at work. And so he goes home, and he gets on the internet, and he kind of draws what he saw, and he posts some pictures on a couple of Reddit forums, and people are like, have you ever heard of the Dogman legend in Michigan? And so they kind of explain, the Dogman legend in Michigan, it is one of the oldest legends that there is. It's mostly northern Michigan, where a lot of people have spotted basically what Jeff saw. A part man, part dog transitioning into man. There's a ton of different lore about what the dog man could be or might be, but there have been a ton of sightings in northern Michigan. And so, Jeff is thinking, I know this thing is supposed to be in northern Michigan, but I guess it could have crossed the border. And he's thinking, obviously a dog man can't be real, but I know there's not bears here, but I know there's not giant walking on 2-legged dogs either. And so he's really freaked out by the experience, but there's literally nobody to tell who's going to believe him. But at least now he feels like he has some concept of maybe what it is that he saw. And he said, I'm the most skeptical guy in the universe, and I just don't believe in anything like supernatural. I just can't possibly explain what we saw that night. Now, luckily, he's taken that same route many times back and forth to work. He has never seen a dog man again. So that's going to do it for today's stories. Again, if you enjoyed this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, then like this video, but then subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell. That way you do get notified every single time I upload new content. And it helps me to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. And once again, if you or anyone you know does have a first-hand account of the supernatural paranormal, please comment below, reach out to me on one of my socials so we can get together, and I will have the honor of telling your tale here on The Orator. So please, until next time, pull up a chair, my fire will be stoked, and I will have another tale to tell.